Hi everybody, Andrew back again, Charlie Black 20 on YouTube. I am not going to be discussing a video today. Instead, I am going to be giving my, and I emphasize my, political analysis slash theories on a question that a lot of progressives have had since the election started. Now, I am going to be giving a rough analysis, and my thoughts are going to kind of go off on different lines of communication all the time. So I'm going to try to be as cogent as possible. The question is, why did Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders butt heads during the Democratic primary? And why did they break apart when, in reality, they are the two most progressive politicians in the entire United States? I think the answer to that lies in so many different things, but I think one idea that I have come up with has some weight to it, which is I don't want to say a psychoanalysis, but maybe a social analysis. And that is that fundamentally, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders look at the issues that progressives fight for and that most Americans fight for. They look at them from two different angles, even though they want the same result. For example, Bernie Sanders has been a senator for a long, long time. And he's also been in the political fight for, I would say, the majority of his adult life. And the first story I remember hearing about him politically, his earliest political story, is that he was arrested for civil disobedience against the police for chaining himself to an African American woman while fighting to desegregate. And when they came to unchain him from the African American woman, he said, "No, if you arrest her, you have to arrest me as well." And that was a very unpopular position to take at the time, especially as a young northern white person coming into areas where segregation was not only socially accepted, but the law of the land. So that was a very big moment. And since that time, Bernie has been fighting for progressive values and workers' rights for all of his political life. He has never strayed from that. Never. Even when it cost him elections in Vermont, in the Senate, he kept fighting for them. Now, Elizabeth Warren, she entered the political arena much later in life by pushing for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau when she wasn't even in office. And she was so strong in her fight and so smart and intellectual in how she went about it in the public arena that they eventually did get it through without her being in the Senate. And when people said that she should be the head of it, the Obama administration, I'm not sure about Obama himself, but the Obama administration basically said, yeah, right, that's not going to happen. We're going to have this woman who talked about our donors and talked about all the people who give us money, and we're going to oversight them, have her watch over them? No thanks. And so Elizabeth Warren, through a lot of urging and I'm sure some ambition of her own, ran for Senate in Massachusetts and won pretty easily. And then she did become part of the Consumer Financial Protection Agency and has helped return billions of dollars to people who were defrauded during the 2008 crisis and after by other places like Wells Fargo. Now, you would think that these two strong progressive fighters would come together and would immediately in 2015, 2016, and then in 2019 up to 2020 would be joined at the hip, fighting for progressive values, fighting for workers' values, fighting against the corruption. But no, there were infights between them, at least on a political scale, I don't think on a personal level, although we have heard rumors. And that is that they broke apart. Elizabeth Warren became the front runner for the Democratic primary for a short while, for I think like a few weeks. And then she started falling behind again in the polls when she backed off of some of her progressive policies and went more to the center, or what we would say in the progressive movement, the more corporatist movement. And she got endorsements from a lot of Obama staffers. I think the number was like 200 of them endorsed her. And a lot of those establishment people joined her campaign. And I think she made a political miscalculation by siding with them, by going further to the center corporate-wise. Beg your pardon. And she fell down in the polls, and a lot of progressives went back to Bernie Sanders, while some went to other candidates who they felt could at least win. While Bernie kept pushing his message of workers' rights, and he managed to win the popular vote in Iowa, even though it was a statistical tie, he wins New Hampshire by a small margin. We expected larger, but he did win New Hampshire. And then he wins Nevada by a huge margin. Like, only Biden came in anywhere close, and that was like 37-52, I believe. Please don't quote me on those numbers. And then South Carolina comes, and Biden manages to squeak through a win. Good for him. And that's where things changed, because all the other corporate, moderate candidates drop out and endorse Joe Biden. And Super Tuesday comes along, and Bernie does not win as many states as many of us had hoped. There had been high hopes for Texas, but there were things going on in Texas that I think were skeevy, unethical, and possibly illegal, but that's a debate for another day. So Biden wins a lot of votes on Super Tuesday, and we continue on, and the writing's on the wall by the time of April 7th, when Biden apparently wins Wisconsin. I have not seen the results yet, because I don't think they are out yet because of COVID. And Bernie drops out of the race and endorses Joe Biden. And Elizabeth Warren had dropped out much earlier. I believe she dropped out not too long after Super Tuesday. Now, we ask ourselves as progressives, what broke those two apart? And there are many different things that did. Political, money, social. I think that it's a fundamental difference in their thinking process. At least that's part of it, a big part of it. Which is that when you look at people who get into political fights, whether it be fighting for Medicare for all, or whether it be fighting for the Financial Protection Bureau, the fact of the matter is that they come at the problem from different angles. Elizabeth Warren came into the political fights much later, and became a star and well known, and she is a progressive. I have no doubt of that. She is a fighter. She is a progressive. But I think that she always has come at things from a intellectual's way of thinking, which is that here's how we can get things done. Here's how we do it. Here's what we can do. Here's who we can do it with. And it's a very strategic, political, analytical, intellectual way of doing things. It's not getting on the ground and getting your hands dirty. It's not fighting every inch, every step. It's fighting for pieces of political ground that you feel you can win, and giving up the ground you feel you can't, so that you have more political capital. It's a very, very sound way to fight a political fight if you care about the political consequences for yourself. And I do think Elizabeth Warren fell into the trap of caring a little bit too much about the politics and not wanting to burn her bridges with the establishment Democrats, because she knows them, Bernie knows them, and she did worry that doing that would harm her political chances, not only for the presidency, but even if she got into the presidency, she would want those bridges there so that she could use them to get votes or to put pressure on them. I think that was a miscalculation on her part because I don't think the Democratic establishment, politicians, especially the donor base, are going to succumb to political pressure from the inside, because as much as the president wields power, the president needs political pressure put on senators and congressmen and different industries for them to be able to push political agendas. That's my opinion. Now, Bernie, the way he comes at a political problem is using everything in his power, using every tool at his disposal that is ethical, and fighting every inch of the way. He doesn't give up a piece of political ground unless he absolutely has to. He fights for the worker every inch of the way. He doesn't have any give in him. Does that mean he's not willing to compromise? Hell no. Hell no. He's willing to compromise on things that matter to both sides. For example, he was willing to negotiate with John McCain on, I believe, for veterans. I believe so. He has negotiated on many different deals, but he's also shown that he has principles and that he won't give up his political principles just to get a vote through. And he's worked with, I believe it was Mike Lee from South Carolina, who is a very right-wing conservative Republican, on getting the War Powers Act enacted so that Trump couldn't unilaterally make military decisions without consulting Congress. The fact of the matter is Congress is the only one that can declare war. The president can't do it. They can only ask Congress to do so. So doing the War Powers Act gives the power back to Congress about the situation in Yemen. And working with Republicans was the only way to do that, and Bernie did it because he doesn't want to fight regime wars, regime change wars, and he doesn't want a genocide in Yemen because of Saudi Arabia, who's supposed to be our ally. Now, forgive me for going on that tangent, but Bernie Sanders has been in the political fight on the ground level from the very beginning of his political career. He uses public pressure, he uses policy decisions, he uses his voting record, he uses everything at his disposal, and he fights every inch. Instead of giving up any ground whatsoever, he fights. Now, you could decide whether that's admirable, reckless, political suicide, political courage. You can decide. But that's what I mean, is that Bernie comes at things from a different angle than Elizabeth Warren does. He's been on the ground floor fighting this forever. Elizabeth Warren came into the fight much later and fights it from an intellectual point of view. They both fight, but they fight it from different angles. I can give you an example of another time where this was different. We all remember the American Civil War and what led up to it. Now, what led up to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which was the spark of the Civil War? What led up to that? Brown was considered a fanatic and a kind of a crazy guy, even by those who agreed with him that slavery had to be eventually abolished. And he was willing to do armed rebellion to do that, arming slaves. Frederick Douglass, who was the most well-known free person in America and was considered the leader of the African American race, gave him money to do so but refused to go with him and said it's crazy to do it. And a lot of northern white abolitionists gave John Brown money but thought he was crazy. The person who thought he wasn't crazy, John Brown, the person who didn't think he was crazy, who agreed with what he was doing, just couldn't go along with him because they had other missions to do, was Harriet Tubman. Now, why did Harriet Tubman agree with them, with John Brown, when Frederick Douglass wouldn't? They had both been enslaved. They had both run away. Why? And it came down to one thing in my mind. They looked at the problem from different angles. Frederick Douglass had escaped, and he had encountered friendliness and honor and respect from white people, including some of his white owners, at least on a certain scale. So he had a different perspective because of the way he had been treated, who he had encountered, all these different things. And so he looked at it as, we need to do this from a social and political way. And we need to give ground where we have to, but we need to keep pushing forward no matter what. Whereas someone like Harriet Tubman had almost never encountered any kind of respect from any white people, especially Southern, at the time. And she kept coming back to the South to help escape slaves. And she had a very different way of doing things. Like, she openly carried weapons. She openly advocated not only escaping, but fighting back. And that made her extremely dangerous to Southern whites. And they put a bounty on her head. I forget how much, but it was a huge amount of money. And so she agreed with the idea of arming slaves for rebellion. Frederick Douglass did not, because he wanted to court Northern whites as well as Northern blacks. Harriet Tubman just believed in freeing her people by any means necessary, which is absolutely a great way to look at things, as well as Frederick Douglass's way. You can find faults either way, and positives either way. So that's another example of people who are fighting on the ground floor versus people who are fighting from the top. So the question you have to decide for yourself as voters, citizens, whatever spectrum, whatever part of the political spectrum you fall under, Republican, independent, progressive, moderate, whatever you fall under, is how would you want to fight politically? Would you want to do it from the intellectual standpoint, where you court those in power and talk about the issues? Or do you want to be somebody who fights from the bottom up and takes down the powerful and moves forward regardless of the political consequences to yourself and those around you? And that's where I think there's a fundamental difference with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They approach the problem from different angles. Both fighters, as I continue to say, both progressives. I think that together they would have made a great team that would have annihilated the corporate media. But they didn't. That's what happened, in my opinion. Now we just have to hope things turn out okay. This is Andrew, signing off again.